Mm. In order that all sentient beings may attain Buddhahood, from my heart I take refuge in the three jewels. In order that all sentient beings may attain Buddhahood, from my heart I take refuge in the three jewels. In order that all sentient beings may attain Buddhahood, from my heart I take refuge in the three jewels. Whatever the virtues of the many fields of knowledge, all are steps on the path of omniscience. May these arise in the clear mirror of intellect. Oh, Manjushri, please accomplish this. Good evening, and welcome back to our continued exploration of the view in the Buddhist tradition, the development, refinement, and further sophistication of the view as it took place in India, and in particular, the Buddhist teachings of Abhidharma evolving, being refined into Madhyamaka, further debate within Madhyamaka, uh, we could say, at least for the purposes of this class, culminating in the presentation, Prasanga presentation by Glorious Moon, Chandra Kirti. Um, so I want to pause for a moment and reflect on how odd it is to be doing this without Derek, and feels a little bit like a ship without a captain. So I'm just hoping that all of you will help me in co-captaining the ship together. All
Sure
right.
thing.
Nothing like a vaguely military reference for, the shambolic crowd. Um,
Go, Chris.
so what was that?
I said, go, Chris. Got this.
So I thought I would begin with a bit of, as we've been doing, a bit of biography about our dear friend Chandra Kirti, um, who's often spelled with an H, but Jan Westerhoff spells without an H. So make of that what you will. He's also known as Chandra, and he's known to us mostly, as all of these authors are, through their works. We're looking at tonight what's surely the most influential and famous of his works, the Madhyamaka Vatara, the Introduction to the Middle Way. Um, but he also has a commentary on Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karaka, the Prasanapada. He's got two commentaries on some of his shorter works. One on the 60 verses of emptiness, the Shunyata Sapatati. I'm just going to skip the Sanskrit for everyone's sake. 60 stanzas on reasoning. He has a commentary on Arya Deva's 400 verses. And in addition to this commentary, the Mula Madhyamaka Karaka, or sorry, the Madhyamaka Vatara that we read tonight, he also produced an auto commentary on that. So a fair amount more literary output, at least that is preserved, than the previous two authors that we've looked at. And since he has received a considerable amount of attention uh, in the discourse around Madhyamaka, um, all of those works have now been translated into European languages. So we're very fortunate to be able to read them. And it's sort of an exciting time in terms of the translations. The Madhyamaka Vatara that we have is translated from Tibetan, and the Sanskrit original was thought to be lost. But miraculously, a few years ago, it was found. So there's a translation of that that's currently underway. That's um, by John Sedaris and another author. And that's going to be published next spring. So that's sort of exciting time to be looking at Chandrakirti. A little bit about his life. Very little is known about the exact details, but he was Uh, Working sometime in the 7th century from around the year 600 to 650 of the Common Era, possibly born in southern India. It does appear that he belonged to Nalanda University and unsurprisingly was teaching and commenting on Madhyamaka texts there. He rose to the position of the chancellor, and he may have held that for as much of a decade. Beyond that, we don't know a whole lot, but there are some extremely colorful hagiographical accounts that you may be familiar with. One involves him milking a painting of a cow to feed some of his fellow monks. Another one involves animating a stone lion to scare away a hostile army. He was also said to be able to move through walls and throw stone vessels without touching them. So as always with these sort of mythical accounts, there's a number of ways of looking at them. And in his introduction, Jan Westerhoff talks about two. One is that it could be a retelling of mundane events. So, for example, as Chancellor of Nalanda University, Chandrakirti was in charge of the university's agricultural output. He had to produce food to feed the monks there. That was part of the job. And milking the cow could be a sort of elaborate mythical telling of his successes with the, farming and production of food there. Likewise, the stone lion could be seen as a mythical telling of deflecting threats from the Shivaituna rulers who at the time were persecuting Buddhists and sacking monasteries. Perhaps more relevant to this course, these mythical accounts could be in some ways a demonstration of his philosophical project. If the apparent world, including causality, is merely convention, perhaps the realized being would have no problem tweaking it in such a way that milk flows from a painting rather than a cow. There's also a really lovely tale of a debate with a lay scholar and grammarian named Chandra Gomin, who is said to be a proponent of Yogacara. And the debate was said to have lasted 6 years. And I'm just going to read from Westerhoff's introduction here. Um, for many months, Chandrakirti presented devastating objections to Chandragoman, which the latter was always able to respond perfectly on the following day. Intrigued by this fact, Chandrakirti suspects foul play and tries to find out who is feeding the answers to his opponent. He finds Chandragoman in the temple of Avalokiteshvara at Nalanda and sees that the stone image of the Bodhisattva of compassion has come to life and teaches Chandragoman how to handle the debates with Chandrakirti. Somewhat surprisingly, instead of being overawed by Chandragoman's ability to converse with such highly realized beings, Chandrakirti complains to Avalokiteshvara and accuses him of favoritism. As one would expect, Avalokiteshvara provides a Arenic response, telling Chandrakirti that he was already blessed by Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of wisdom, and therefore does not require Avalokiteshvara's support, who has in consequence decided to lend a helping hand to Chandragoman. What's interesting is that the accounts of this, which come from Tibet, they don't tell us who won the debate. And this provides us a frame for interpreting the Madhyamaka Yogacara debate less as an intellectual competition with one victorious and one defeated party, and more as a tool for generating deeper understanding of the Buddha's teachings. After all, Avalokiteshvara and Manjushri are equally realized bodhisattvas, and if one takes the side of Yogacara and one that of Madhyamaka, the image presented cannot be one of a relationship between two systems where we simply have to settle the question of which of the two is right. So I just thought that was sort of a lovely little image. One of the really interesting things as we look into the history of Chandrakirti, we all know him as this sort of towering figure in Madhyamaka, so central to how it has come down to us and in terms of shaping the contours of the discourse within Tibet. But when we look back to India, it seems as though he had very little impact. So central Indian commentators such as Shantarakshita and Kamalashila show no awareness of his work. And in fact, only one commentary was ever written in India. Um, so it may seem perhaps that the manuscripts of Chandrakirti were lost in the back of a library, only to be rediscovered in the process of bringing translations to Tibet. However, that doesn't accord very well with the status of palm leaf manuscripts and the humidity of India. And if they were preserved that long, they would have had to have been copied sort of over and over again. And you do see mention of these texts by Shantideva in the 8th century, by Avalokiteshvara in the 8th century, and that's who wrote the longest work in the Tengyur, the commentary on Bhaviveka that we talked about in last class. And then a few other commentaries mention him, but a few other commentators mention him, although they were not producing commentaries on his work. However, it's clear that Atisha, who played a huge role in introducing Buddhism to Tibet, considered Chandrakirti's reading of Nagarjuna to be authoritative. Uh, so the Madhyamaka Vatara was translated twice into Tibetan, once by Atisha's students in the 11th century and once about 100 years later. And that was the translation that caught on, and it rapidly became the authoritative way of interpreting Madhyamaka in Tibet, producing a number of commentaries, including the ones that I circulated prior to this class by Mipam and Chandrakirti. And what we see in those commentaries is that while Chandrakirti and the Prasanga method became sort of the orthodox position of Tibetan Buddhism, how exactly to interpret him beyond that is anything but settled. So, what is this text that we're reading? I remember when I first encountered this text and had this idea of Chandrakirti as this Madhyamaka figure, I was quite surprised to see the structure of this text, which rather than being a series of arguments like we see in Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karika, is structured along the 10 bhumis. And I wondered if anyone had any thoughts about that particular formal device of structuring this text in this way.
I mean, I could throw out some random ideas.
Sure.
One is that it does tend to connect one with the sense of path and
Mhm.
who's moving on that path. So it kind of gives you the notion of, you're connecting with the level of bodhisattvas moving along those particular bhumis.
Mhm.
Um, and I guess, being able to sort of associate with the qualities of the different bhumis, like starting out with compassion in the joyful one and all that. But yeah, somehow path is what came to mind for me, just the sense of this context rather than it being just completely um, kind of logical, analytical.
So, what would you suppose it says about the teachings of the view to locate them within the teachings of the path?
I mean, it seems like there's a sort of a practical aspect of,
Mhm.
this is how the rubber meets the road by somehow engaging in the path with this view. But
Mm.
you could probably say more about what you're thinking there.
Um, I think for me, it's I've come to think about it as that. the view, and this is sort of a overall way that I've come to look at things, is that the view never stands in isolation from the path, and that every statement about the view is a statement about the path. Um, which again is a thing that really distinguishes um, Buddhist philosophy from Western philosophy, that it is connected with an idea of movement towards liberation from suffering and has a position on that. And interestingly, right, this is located at the sixth bhumi rather than, say, the last bhumi, or at full Buddhahood. And that to me suggests that there's a certain amount of provisionality to any view, um, which ultimately is abandoned um, as one reaches higher and higher stages of enlightenment. Rob.
So if you don't turn off your sound, I'm going to echo. Um, I'm if by organizing it in terms of the boomies, it's I think it reinforces in non-realized people the efficaciousness of the path because it's sort of like report cards from the cushion from realized people. It's not uh, conjecture. That's my thinking on it.
So seeing the view as not sort of like intellectual speculation per se, but as like a real part of the path and efficacious. Cool.
Correct. It reinforces experience and gives explanation to experience.
Yeah, Mary Beth.
One thing that jumped out at me is that it's really long. And like all of the other ones are super, super short, except for this particular one, the sixth one.
The sixth chapter.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, yeah, over half of the text is the sixth chapter.
yeah, I guess I felt like maybe that's sort of saying, I mean, it's very important.
Mm. Hmm.
And maybe not. I don't know. I mean, why? Why is it like it's like even like four times longer than the longest one or something, which is the last one?
Hmm.
What's up with that?
Yeah, part of me feels like he's just like wants to get these other ones out of the way so he can get to the sixth boomy. But so this is yes, this is a commentary on the on Nagarjuna's Mulabanyamaka Karika, right? And specifically the first chapter on causality, but this is also a commentary on the Dashabhumika Sutra, the 10 stages sutra, which is one of several Mahayana sutras that lay out the so-called grounds, the Bodhisattva grounds, the 10 stages that the Bodhisattva moves through progressively as they develop from a Bodhisattva, a fledgling first stage Bodhisattva to a full stage Buddha. Um, and and each of those grounds, as described in the Dashabhumika Sutra, are associated with one of the paramitas, the perfections, the activities that a bodhisattva participates in. So there's the usual list of the six paramitas that we all know. So generosity, discipline, patience, exertion, meditation, wisdom, which gets us to chapter six, right? So, unsurprisingly, the wisdom chapter is going to have a lot to say about wisdom. Um, and just for people who are curious how the list ends, since we know there's six, the remaining four of the 10 paramitas are followed by, in the seventh bhumi, skillful means, in the eighth, vows, in the ninth, power, and in the 10th, jhana. So those are the 10 bhumis that you can read about in the Dashabhumika Sutra. Um, so the translation of the sixth chapter that we have from Westerhoff is directly facing. That's a little different than what we have in the translation of the root text uh, from the Padmakara translation group. They translate it as clearly manifest or irreversibly advancing. So directly facing Westerhoff's translation, um, it deals with the perfection of wisdom and what in particular is directly faced. What is directly faced at this point is emptiness, also known by in the Madhyamaka tradition as dependent origination. And bodhisattvas at this stage are said to possess the ability to enter into a meditation on emptiness for long periods of time. Um, the previous Bhumi, whose name I don't recall, hard to keep, is about the paramita of meditation. So it's through perfecting the paramita of meditation that the wisdom of the six bhumi is perceived. And interestingly, at this point, the sixth bhumi of wisdom sort of transforms and suffuses the previous five paramitas. That actions like generosity by themselves are not necessarily seen as efficacious for obtaining the goal of enlightenment. But when they become suffused with the non-dual wisdom of the sixth stage, they become efficacious. And the metaphor that Chandrakirti gives is that of a sighted person leading a group of blind people. And the sighted person in this case is the perfection of wisdom, and the blind people are the paramitas, which now, with a guide, can be led to their destination. So at this point, Chandrakirti introduces Nagarjuna as providing the basis rather than the scriptures. He presents Nagarjuna as the basis for the arguments that he's going to make in this chapter. And demonstrates Nagarjuna's authority on the basis of sutras such as the Lankavatara Sutra, which prophesized his coming, which is a device we've seen in other Madhyamaka texts before. And then he talks about the qualities of the student suited for emptiness, because this is a path-based teaching. It's important that the people that it is taught to are sufficiently ready and able to make use of the teachings. And talks about these students, their hair stands on end and they get very excited, and there's sort of these physical signs. He says, this is the fourth sloka, source page 68. Certain simple, ordinary people, when they hear of emptiness, will feel a joy that leaps and surges in their hearts. Their eyes will fill with tears, their hairs upon their skin stand up. Such people are the vessels for the teaching. They have the seed of wisdom, perfect Buddhahood. The final truth should be revealed to them, in whom ensuing qualities will come to birth. So I'm assuming all of you are all of your eyes are filled with tears and your hairs are standing up on end. Um, Otherwise, it would be inappropriate for us to go any further with these teachings. And then he moves to a discussion of ethics, right? So within the context of Madhyamaka, ethics is always the concern. That we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We do not want to lose ethics in our presentation of emptiness. And so he has some presentation on once you realize the profound truth of emptiness, you will naturally want to do everything you can to spend as much time as possible contemplating it and meditating on it. And thus, it is very important to engage in ethical behavior so that you might be reborn as a human, so you can continue this contemplation. So this is sort of a different kind of argument than we see for karma and ethics in other presentations, but one that may have a certain level of efficaciousness to it. And let's see, once we have dispensed with these somewhat perfunctory introductory remarks, we move into the 4 stages of causal production. Familiar from everything we've been talking about the last month or so, the 4 options. We have production from self, production from other, production from both, and then production from neither. So this is the tetralemma, the famous tetralemma, which is taken to be an exhaustive account that if production doesn't exist in any one of those, it cannot be said to exist in a meaningful way at all. And Chandrakirti will move through these one by one, demonstrating that none of them withstand philosophical scrutiny. And what he also does is he associates each of them with a particular philosophical school. And I thought that Westerhoff's commentary on that was particularly interesting. And let me just find it. Yeah. Okay, so this is page 62 in the source. And let me, sorry, I don't really have the, can anyone tell me what that is in the source book while I pull the source book up?
319.
319, thank you. So this is about second full paragraph, sort of halfway through. It is worthwhile to keep in mind, though, that the presentation of alternative views in Buddhist philosophical texts often plays a double role. One is the refutation of philosophical opponents, and to gauge the success of this, the question of whether we are presented with a faithful summary of a rival position or with a conveniently constructed straw man is important. However, the defense of his specific interpretation of Madhyamaka against all rivals is not Chandrakirti's only, perhaps not even his primary goal. His main objective is to present his students with a route to the direct realization of emptiness. In this context, the rival views can be understood in a second sense, namely as misinterpretations of Madhyamaka, and more generally of the teachings of the Buddha, that students might develop on their way towards an understanding of emptiness. Understood in this way, The most important thing about a philosophical theory, like, say, causation from itself, is not whether a particular proponent of the specific school of classical Indian thought really held that view, but that the student of Madhyamaka might mistakenly regard this as a plausible philosophical position that presents a conceptually stable alternative to the theory of universal emptiness. Skipping down to the last full sentence of that paragraph, it may point out a location in conceptual space that the student of Madhyamaka might initially find attractive, even though it turns out on closer analysis to be intrinsically problematic. So I think it's important to, as we read these, to understand them as potential traps or cul-de-sacs or mistaken views that we might find ourselves subscribing to. Um, I remember talking to someone about an alternative Lojog slogan, regards some dharmas as dreams. Um, so, so I think that we all have little corners of some of reification that we might like to hold on to. Cynthia.
I was just going to say that as I read those comments of his, it made me think of also the same thing is true, that same sort of logic is true in how we look at, for example, the different tenet systems. Like in reading the Kenpo's book, The Progressive Stages, it's often talked about in that same way, that rather
Mhm.
than thinking about, we're just critiquing these, you know, um, primitive thinking people, we're actually looking at stages of belief that we may either be going through or have gone through or might in the
Mhm.
future go through.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's important to not read this as, encyclopedia of classical Indian thought necessarily. Um, and while he may have a real goal, as we saw with Bhaviveka, of responding to certain opponents of classical India, um, his main objective is helping people move along the Buddhist path.
Though it is
Um,
funny that they sort of otherize instead of just saying, you might think, as if you were talking to your actual student, but instead they otherize it into a whole
mhm.
school, which is, you know, a little bit funny in terms of, you know, because it's not, you could actually just directly talk to, if you were trying to do that relative to your listeners and say, you might be thinking or wondering about this, but instead they blame it on a school.
Right, right, yeah. I mean, it could be that these tenant systems were well known at the time, and also maybe represented a greater level of philosophical sophistication than purported views of half-baked students. Um, but anyway, the first option is production from itself. Um, we've gone over the arguments for this um, several times already, it seems. So I don't want to deal too much with them, but maybe we can speak a little briefly about, what a Buddhist version of production from itself might look like. Anyone have any ideas? Yeah, Rob.
Um, there are no distinct things. Everything is conceptually designated, so there is no distinctness. So the whole creates the whole at all times, um, and that's true also on a relative level. So, like in science, if we were to talk about it, and where science kind of agrees, is that there aren't really distinct trees. There's formations that are treeing that are and there's a luminous boundary between treeing and skying and earthing, and all of that, is part of planeting. Um, and so basically, it's about interdependence.
So
So sort of the
sort of the idea of this like there's like a demiurge of raw material that coalesces into things like trees and laptops and Zoom rooms. And yeah, I think another one I think about is the three kayas. I think it's possible to understand the three kayas as, there's this unified field of the Dharmakaya that, manifests in the Sambhogakaya and Nirmanakaya in a way that feels similar to this idea of, yeah, like a primordial ground from which things emerge in a real reified way. Rob.
Rob.
Another thing that comes to mind is if if everything is the cause of everything, it's almost like saying nothing is the cause.
Cynthia?
And I guess in another sense, the sort of Chittamatra view, or the, that things are all mind on some level, is another way of, in a sense, that's a kind of a self production or non self production, but um, it's basically trying to say there isn't an other there.
Yeah, the idea of taking different forms, but there being some sort of like primal stuff out of which the universe is built.
I mean, I've been reading through those profound inner topics descriptions of it, and where it's like it's just kind of this stirring that causes this illusion of the creation of a self and other, but that it's all really mental.
Stephen, did you have something?
Yeah. On page 64, maybe this is self-evident to everybody, but not to me. The second full paragraph where it says, but as the seed needs to disappear for the sprout to arise, for the seed turns into the sprout, there would be no time at which the sprout could come into existence from the seeds. Sprouts could never be produced from seeds. Well, if you look at a seed, you can have both a seed and a sprout at the same time. In most cases, a sprout will pop out of a seed and a seed is still there. In a sense, it's almost like, this gets back to the old causality business. I was thinking of another case where if you had a wood fire, and once you got the fire going and you have a fire, you still need the cause, the wood. If you take away the wood, the fire goes away. So I guess, in some sense, there's many causes that would result in a fruition. And some of them may, it seems, occur at the same time as the fruition. What am I missing?
Yeah, thanks for that, Steve. So would I take the move you're making to sort of the simplistic picture is at time one, you have seed, and at time two, you have sprout. And you're saying there's actually sort of what we could call time one and a half, where you have this thing that's half seed and half sprout, right? And I think Chandrakirti is aware of this possible response, um, and just very briefly wants to say that doesn't actually change these relationships themselves. Taking a more fine-grained view of time doesn't solve the underlying problem. Um, and this is just on the following page. The second full, or the first full paragraph. This is page 65 of the source text. A position the opponent might take here in response is that a seed is really a succession of very brief seed moments, one happening after another, and each moment causing its successor moment. So the seed moment at T1 causes the seed moment at T2, and since each each is a seed moment, we might regard this as a form of self-causation. However, the two seed moments might not be exactly identical. The preceding one might be a little bit different from the succeeding one, and so on over time we get from a seed to a sprout. Self-causation, hence, does not have to rule out causally mediated change. Chandrakirti's next verse, which is verse 10, begins by responding to this proposal. And maybe we can read the verse just for
I'm
fun.
sorry, I'm kind of lost on the pagination that you're using.
Yeah, I'm in the source text, page 65
Source text of the Westerhoff?
of the Westerhoff. Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Um,
So, oh, I'm okay. I get it.
yeah.
I'm just,
Um,
thank you. I just
sure,
not
sure.
looking
And
to see those are on the top of the page.
yeah. I'm sorry. I'm trying to pull up the actual page in the source book.
Oh, that's okay. I just didn't see that that was available at the top, so I was just kind of lost. What page is it again?
Yeah.
64?
Yeah, this is page 65, and in the source book it's page 322.
Right, yeah, that's fine. I didn't see that those were
Yeah,
both available in
great.
the same document. Thank you.
Okay, and then I'm gonna just read the source verse, just to make sure we're actually referring back to it. Um, a shoot that's different from the seed that causes it, in shape and color, virtue, taste, and ripening, could not exist if what you say it's true. And if the former entity gives place to something else, indeed, what comes of their identity? And then here is how Jan Westerhoff explains that. Chandrakirti's next verse, and I'm back on source source page 65. Chandrakirti's next verse begins by responding to this proposal, pointing out the suggested combination of self-causation and change does not work. The position Chandrakirti is concerned with when discussing causal productions from itself is not one in which cause and effect are very similar, but one in which they are identical. Identical things need to share all their properties. If every step in the change of seed moments is identical to its successor, there is no change. If it is different, there is no self-causation. If the seed changed its qualities when turning into a sprout, turning green, changing its shape, and so on, it is unclear how we could still speak of the same entity being present. Unless we deny the indiscernibility of identicals, objects that are one and the same should share all the same properties. So yeah, just returning to what I said at the beginning, it doesn't matter if the change is big or if it's small. As long as the two things are not identical, then it's not self-causation. Does that make sense, Steve?
I guess I understand how it's not self-causation because if you just took a seed and put it on a table and just left it there, probably nothing would happen. You wouldn't get a sprout.
Hmm.
But if you start throwing it in dirt, add a little water, fertilizer, put it out in the sun, you're going to get a sprout if you're lucky. And but if he's defining it as only the seed, you're not allowed to have water, you're not allowed to add dirt, you're not allowed to do any of that stuff. You're just going to have a seed, and that will not produce a sprout. I would agree with that.
Well, I think even if it did, I mean, let's just assume you had some sort of miraculous sprout that could turn in a miraculous seed that could turn into a sprout with any other conditions. Um, we could take any other example, maybe a bomb that detonates itself or whatever you like. You still run into the same problem where at time one and at time two, the entity being described is not identical. At time one, you have a seed. At time two, you have a sprout, or you have a seed with a little bit of a sprout sticking out of it. Doesn't really matter. The point is they're not identical. If they are identical, there can't be change. If they're not identical, it's not self-causation, which then moves it into our next section about critiquing causation from other.
Yeah, because I guess what I'm talking about is self and other.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's important always to keep our sights on the Abhidharmikas here, and remember that ultimately this is a critique of Abhidharma and this sort of like very essential, very hard definition of identity. That if they didn't provide it themselves, Nagarjuna put those words in their mouth. Um, that that things have to be have no parts, be mereologically simple, and be conceptually simple, and to not stand in dependence relations on anything else. And
Okay,
that's what it means
that's
to have
helpful.
Svabhava.
That's helpful. Thanks.
Yeah. Cynthia.
I just, as I went through all of those different aspects of the self production, the one thing that I wasn't entirely clear on because of the different 7 points that Westerhoff gave and all these, is when we talk about self and the fact that it has to be an identity, is the notion, if even if we're one to conceive that it is possible, which we have concluded it's not, that production from self would not be creating endless replicas of itself because those would not be the same in location, for example. So are they conceiving that, I mean, essentially production of from self would seem to mean nothing actually happens. I mean, there's two different ways you could look at it. Either you create a million replicas of the seats, so you end up with this massive pile of seats piling up, but they're not the same because they're not in the same physical location, so they don't have that identity thing,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
But then the other option is that basically it's just a seed sitting there and it could be miraculously replicating itself forever and nothing looks like it's happening, right?
Yeah, I think that's correct.
So the idea is more that it's not a pile of replicas, it's just, I don't know, it just doesn't, neither of these
Yeah,
make
they're
sense.
both absurd consequences that,
Right. I
don't.
because location, difference of location is already a difference.
Mhm. Yeah.
One sitting next to the next one.
Yeah, or you have what's maybe even a bigger philosophical problem of like you have multiple seeds occupying the same spatiotemporal location.
Right, right. Which
Which
one, I
is
mean, how
a
would one know if
contradiction.
that were happening?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. How could they be distinguished from one another? Yeah. Yeah, so of course the issue that we're always coming up with when we read Madhyamaka is what Cynthia was just struggling with of uh, trying to articulate a coherent version of what the person they're arguing with could be saying. Um, yeah. So he gives, as Cynthia mentioned, seven basic arguments. Westerhoff does for why uh, production from self wouldn't work. This is on source page 69 and in the source book, page 326. And I'll just read them. Production would be pointless. The effect would never be produced. Production would be endless. Cause and effect would have the same qualities. We would always observe either both cause and effect or neither. This would contradict the conventional understanding of causation. The actor and agent and producer and produced would be identical. So, unless anyone has anything else to say on the topic of, yes, Cynthia.
Again, it's kind of this similar thing as I was saying before, but it what struck me also was that number five of this and number seven, um, it again gets to this question of if we're saying what are we going to see, we would either see both or neither. Um, but again, dealing with this question of would there be two, would there be one, um, and the number seven, the idea of producer and produced being identical. Again, this question of is it two or one at that point? Are there two seeds sitting next to each other or
Hmm.
looking identical, or in fact, is that not possible? And it would have to be in the same thing co-located
Yeah.
in
Yeah,
space.
it's just
So
they
even
become
these seem kind of
indiscernible.
even these points seem like they kind of bend your mind a little in terms of they can't all make sense.
Yeah. Yeah, so maybe we could just try to like cash that out in terms of our misunderstood. We gave some examples of a misunderstood Buddhist view, a wrong Buddhist view, and I'll just give it a stab. I talked about the three kayas. Um, so if the Dharmakaya causes in some essential way the Sambhogakaya, then the Dharmakaya and the Sambhogakaya would be identical. And um, that would be a problem. Because then why would we refer to them differently? Um, I'm trying to find one more thing before we move on, but maybe we should. Yeah, why don't we move on? Okay, so we are moving on to, again, we're still on page 69, just below that list, source book page 326, production from another. Refutation from production from another through reasoning with reference to an absurd consequence. So production from another appears much more reasonable than self-causation, right? This is how we conventionally think about things. So you take your pencil and you make a line on the paper, and the pencil caused the line on the paper. The pencil and the line on the paper are different things, but we have no problem if someone came in and say, how'd you put that line on that paper? We would have no problem pointing to the pencil. No? Um, I'm just going to read the first full paragraph on chapter 70, the chapter page 70, the following page in the source book. Uh, However, Chandrakirti does not consider production from another to be a satisfactory analysis of causation either. The problem he discusses in this verse is that while supposition of causal self-production face difficulties with differentiating cause and effect, production from another faces the difficulty of bringing two distinct entities into a single causal relation. It is important to realize that the notion of distinctness between cause and effect the opponent has in mind here is much more substantial than mere non-identity. And this is right, getting back to the Abhidharma definitions. Strong cases of identity. It entails that two entities considered different by their intrinsic natures, and that therefore there is no dependence relation between them. A rice seed causes a rice sprout, but a barley seed and a wheat seed do not. Yet, when conceived according to this understanding of distinctness, the rice seed is as much a distinct entity from the rice sprout as the barley and wheat seeds are. If causation is a relation between such intrinsically distinct, independent entities, why does it only connect some distinct entities, such as the rice seed and rice sprout, but not others, such as the barley seed and rice sprout? There does not seem to be anything in the individual entities that make one more likely to causally link up with another, since any such potential for linkage would conflict with the strong independence assumed to hold between them. We appear to face the absurd consequence that everything could be causally produced by anything. Um, does that make sense? I've always struggled with this argument because it's just so preposterous that anything could come from anything. It seems to fly so in the face of how we normally think of rice seeds and barley seeds. Um, Anyone have any thoughts? All right. Um,
maybe maybe the key here is the words intrinsically distinct, independent entities. If you define things as being essentially completely different, then how could you end up with a causal relationship between the two?
Hmm.
And if they are completely different, then any of those things related to a third or fourth or fifth thing would also be completely different. And so how could you have a causal relationship there? Or if you flipped it around, if you say that things that are completely different could have a causal relationship, then you have to say that causal relationships could occur with everything because everything would be completely different.
Hmm.
Does that make any sense?
Yeah, yeah. I, I think the issue is that, yeah, how do you get these things to link up? You know, because you don't want them to be the same for reasons that we've just addressed in the previous section. Um, but if they're different, how do you get them to link up with one another? Why don't they link up with any other thing? Cynthia.
And so, in one sense, isn't this where the problem really is with the whole notion of svabhava or of some kind of self nature, and the notion of a thing at all? I mean, this is where essentially the whole premise of there being fixed things of any kind breaks down. I mean, in some ways,
Mhm.
the heart of it is there. Rather than trying to get into all these nuances of how you get from A to B, the problem is there A, is there B?
That's right.
I think that seems like, in some ways, the heart of the matter, even though they go through all these tortuous arguments, um, rather than going straight to that essential point.
It's sort of like if you say something has svabhava, an intrinsic nature that cannot be changed, then how you've already defined away its ability to cause something with working with something else that also has its own svabhava.
I
Hmm.
mean, the thing is that we have, I think, in our conventional minds, we have these notions like of continuums, and
Hmm.
and that's why a rice seed connects with a rice sprout, and a barley seed connects with a barley sprout. All these notions of continua are part of our just conventional thinking, whether they make any logical sense or not. It's just the way we tend to um, conceive of things. And yet, the notion of that in itself would seem to sort of contradict any notion of svabhava. How is there both svabhava and change?
Hmm. Yeah, so Chandrakirti does address this idea of continua, right? So um, in this is Westerhoff in the following page, 71. In his commentary, first full paragraph, in his auto commentary, Chandrakirti raises the worry that the opponent has to accept it as a brute fact that the rice seed and rice sprout belong to one continuum, while the rice seed and barley sprout do not. The opponent cannot refer to anything in these entities, since any such thing would undermine the strong notion of their distinctness assumed here. If it is part of entity X's nature to bring about entity Y, the natures of X and Y cannot be wholly separable. Talk about continua seems to be nothing more than a complicated way of saying that A causes B rather than A causing C, because A causes B rather than A causing C, without providing any reason, as the opponent set out to do, why not everything causes everything else. So this is to say that placing entities in a continua rather than just like one moment after another doesn't actually solve the problem at all. You still have this same issue of needing to explain how a thing can cause something else, how one thing and how that again that problem with the linkage of getting entity one and entity two to link up even if they're wholly distinct. introducing a continuum doesn't explain away that problem, um, unless you are proposing to reintroduce the problem of self-causation, and now that self-causation takes the form of a continuum. But this feels very similar to the issue of that Stephen raised earlier of the seed changing only a little bit. Um, that and on one hand, you want to push it towards self-causation. On the other hand, you want to push it towards other causation, neither of which are tenable options. So, Mary Beth, did you? Oh, Chris.
We can't
Uh,
hear you.
we can't hear you, Chris.
We can't hear you, Chris.
Nope. So, yeah. Do you wanna type your thing in the chat, maybe? Okay, so while Chris types that, I'm going to continue moving forward in our discussion of causation from other. Um, so we have another argument on 612. Or no, sorry. Nope. Never mind. Disregard that. We've already done that. Okay. So we have some arguments about production from another through reasoning with reference to time.
Recording.
Oh, hey, Chris. Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yeah, okay. Now my mic is on. Right?
Your mic is on, but you seem to be frozen. But as long as we can hear
Yeah,
you, that's fine.
either way. Yeah, I was just saying that either in a continuum or one-to-one relationship, you, you can't break anything down that way. Everything is combinatorial explosive. Like we could go on forever, especially with science. We keep reducing things down. And it, maybe is that what they're trying to get at here is you again, we try to that's what we do with language, right? We simplify everything, but you can't, in ultimate reality, you can't do that.
Hmm. That does seem to be the argument that's being made. And maybe we can return back to the beginning of this chapter. Um, which you don't have in the source book, so I'm just going to read it from the book. Um, I think I've mentioned this before. The impossible thing about this class was trying to reduce the readings to a manageable level. Yeah, so I'm just reading from the beginning. This is just from his commentary on the first verse of this chapter. In Madhyamaka, more specifically, dependent origination is equated with the notion of emptiness. One way of conceiving of dependent origination is by understanding it as the opposite of Humean supervenience, which is the doctrine that all there is to the world is a vast mosaic of local matters of particular fact, just one little thing after another. And I think this is how we think all the time, right? Is that the world is sort of made out of Legos, and we could pull one part out of it and look at it and, call it an individual. And, the main Lego piece that we do this with is, me. you know, and well, life could have been different if I picked myself out of the Lego set and moved it to a different part of the Lego set. Um, and so this is a sort of common sense notion. Um, to pursue this example, if you take any piece out of the mosaic, it will retain its color. If Humean supervenience did not hold, and the color of each piece was not simply a local matter, its color might change when separated from its neighbors. So in this metaphor, you pick the Lego up, and all of a sudden it's a different color Lego because you've removed it from the context that it was embedded in. Dependent origination holds that the world does not simply consist of an array of individuals, each of which has its properties simply by itself, but that things are connected by a network of dependence relations. And then he has this kind of an interesting background in optical illusions, and he uses an example of Rubik's Cube example. Let me just pull that up because it's so cool. Illusion. Da. Yeah, okay. So I'm gonna just share my screen. So you can see here the Rubik's Cube. Um, and you see those two arrows? Um, those are the same color. Those two bricks on the Rubik's Cube are the same color. And if you I had to, when I first saw this illusion, I had to do this on Photoshop of actually pulling one next to the, pulling this one next to that one. They're the same color. The point he's making here is that this is how all entities, according to dependent origination, this is how all entities in the world are, that everything owes its identity to the local context in which it finds itself. Cynthia.
Yeah, that's great. I'm curious in the what I think you were reading. I don't know if it was directly from Westerhoff, was saying the
It
world.
was, and then I was kind of commenting on
Okay, so
it.
saying that the world is not an array of individual, like as in Lego pieces, but that things are connected by a network of dependent relations. But that still is saying things are connected as if there are individual things. So are they actually kind of going beyond that notion of things into a more or a more kind of a all in flux type of model?
I think it's taking that model to a real extreme level in which things are so dependent on other things that we can't even conceptually distinguish them, can't even talk about them as being individuals. That all there is dependence.
Right. Okay. That's what I wanted to kind of clarify because
Yeah.
this
Yeah, it's not as though it's some sort of grid or matrix or something with real points and real relations that we can talk about as though they were individual.
right
Um,
language becomes quite difficult when you talk about this. So
yeah,
I just
yeah,
wanted to
that's
make
right.
sure that we were talking more about that sort of
Yeah,
mass of
and but it also doesn't necessarily create the sort of ontological picture that you see in the Indra's net example, where every bit of phenomena relies existentially on every other bit of phenomena. Um, it could be that entities only rely on some other entity for their existence or
but are we still
existence.
talking about entities? That's my
Yeah,
main question.
yeah. Only insofar as it helps illustrate the metaphor, I guess. Um, yeah, yeah, Rob.
It also depends on the mind that's perceiving the situation.
Yes,
The
thank
the
you.
the colors, some sentient beings can't even see color. Others Others, like bats, it's sonar. I mean, so the what's discrete for a human is not the same as what's discrete for other mammals. So there is that. And the other thing, the question I sort of have is, and it's not really addressed in the reading. Um, if there's no causes, what does that say about free will?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think as in particular as Westerners, that's like such a let me say it like this. It's a that is a philosophical problem that is unique to us, and that I don't think is one that Chandrakirti or any of the folks in the Buddhist tradition were really wrestling with. Um, and it is Jay Garfield talks about that. I mean, he's pretty strong on this that you shouldn't ever talk about free will in the context of Buddhist philosophy, because he sees it as like an inherently Christian import that because the question of free will has so much to do in Western history as related to the idea of a creator God, and is he benevolent, and does he give us choice to sin or do virtuous deeds. um that yeah, that just wasn't part of the world that these guys were living in. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't still think about it. And Cynthia.
Well, I don't know if this is, maybe it's a little bit different, but it's sort of related, I think, in a different, maybe not relative to God, but I know Zongsa Khyentse loves to talk about the complexities when you're talking about karma, or, if we don't, if we're not the same being moment to moment to moment, then what does it do to, let's say, the criminal justice system and accountability for your actions? It's like, you're in the trial and it's like, no, that wasn't me. That was me, 2 months ago. So you get the idea. But
Right. Rob, you wanna respond to that?
Well, not so much respond as I forget who said it. I'm not. This isn't me saying this. It's a quote. I forget the guy's name, but he said, "I must believe in free will. I have no choice."
That's good.
Trungpa
Uh,
Rinpoche's book on karma talks a little about this. I can't remember if he uses the term free will, but he does talk about the whole issue of if your karma brought you to where you are, do you have any ability do you have any choice going forward? And there's whole sections in that book about that. I think it's called The Future is Open.
that
I
is
can't remember
correct.
exactly.
Yeah. And that, I mean, the question is that the same as the question of free will or not? But definitely, yeah, that book is a great book. I've been reading it lately along with another class, and it, definitely the view there is that there is an openness. But the question is that the same as what you mean by free will? I'm not sure. I think there's some different, as Chris mentioned, maybe different baggage on what that means. But yeah,
yeah.
how much, karma only comes up to the present. It does not extend automatically into the future.
Yeah, and it does seem that the very premise of the Buddha's path is that you can change, right? I mean, if it was all this deterministic thing, then why would we bother with all of this? You know? But of course, we have many, many teachings on how karma can be interrupted. Um, So, if we maybe it's a little less squeamish if we use the word agency and talk about to what extent we have agency. Maybe that's just you know a rose by any other name. But it does appear that there is the possibility to um, do something different, right? Um, and I think that, I mean, maybe we could just jump ahead to the end of this chapter, to the conversation about karma. So we seem to be kind of going there. And you'll recall I had to send an extra page um, in the email for this. Um, and So, as I referenced earlier, the one of the main concerns for the Madhyamaka is going to be um, how if nothing bottoms out anywhere, how moral action and virtue and karma uh, will be preserved. Um, how to avoid this sort of nihilistic view of emptiness that says everything is permitted because there's no causality. Because there's no causality, there are no consequences, and we're free to rob convenience stores and eat ice cream all day and be mean to our family members. Um, so this is on uh, page 87 of the source. And that's going to be in your source book, page 344. Accounting for karma. This is the second full paragraph. Accounting for karma, one of the advantages of accounting for causation without underlying ontological foundations, in other words, accounting for causation without swabhava, in other words, causation existing on the level of conventional truth. Accounting for causation without underlying ontological foundations and without resorting to notions of annihilation or permanence is that it solves the problem of how the Buddhists should explain the existence of karmic causality. The relevant parties in this discussion all accept the principle of momentariness. So this is that Sautrantrika view that no entity exists longer than a temporally unextended moment, nothing has temporal thickness, and presentism, past and future entities, does not exist. It is not straightforward to explain how my present intention will produce a karmic result in 5 minutes or 5 years, right? Because if the past and present don't exist, and if the past and future don't exist, and only the present exists, how, pray tell, will karma produced in the present cause an action in a distant time in the future, not in the immediately succeeding moment, but in 5 years or 5 minutes? Going back to the reading, if the karmic impulse still existed at the time, it would have to be permanent or at least non-momentary. And if it was completely annihilated, as everything that exists now, including all mental and physical states, will be non-existent in the next moment, it is unclear how it could still produce its specific result. Buddhist philosophers have developed various theories to account for this, and I think primarily this is referring to the Alaya Vijnana, right? But Chandrakirti's Madhyamaka does not have to engage with these. He does not have to explain how a perished karmic potential could suddenly become active years later, since something that has never arisen also cannot perish. Discussing the arising and ceasing of entities with intrinsic nature presupposes that we refer to ultimately real things. Karmic causation, like other causation, clearly obtains, but the quest to identify the unique mechanism at the ultimate level of reality makes it obtain is futile, since such an ultimate level, conceived of as a collection of fundamentally real entities with intrinsic natures, does not exist. So the idea here is that because karma only exists on the level of conventionality, just like other causes, the Madhyamaka does not have to explain how it works on an ultimate level, because causality is understood to be illusory, so is the causality of karma. That does not mean that actions don't produce results, um, any more than the activity of walking in front of a mirror doesn't produce a reflection, right? It like if you do a karmic deed at one time, it will ripen at a later time. If you walk in front of a mirror, you'll see your face. The Madhyamaka doesn't have to explain how those things happen on a substantial, ontologically grounded way, um, and forecloses the possibility of such an explanation even being possible. Um, but at the same time, uh, wants to preserve the regularity of those events. So this we're sort of going backwards here, but this gets us to his treatment of the two truths. This is source book page or source page 76, source book page 333. First full paragraph under the heading The Two Truths. To appeal to ordinary perception and intersubjective consensus. So he's talking about arguments about causality that refer to common sense notions, right? Like we were talking earlier about the pencil and the mark on the paper. Those are ordinary perceptions and intersubjective consensus, right? Meaning I perceived the pencil moving and I saw the line. Intersubjective consensus. We all agree that that's how the mark on the page got made, right? Appealing to those sorts of things only makes sense if we assume they are generally accurate. If we assume our common sense notions are accurate. Chandrakirti does not, and instead introduces the idea of the two truths. According to this, all things have a double character. Their ultimate way of existence when they are correctly seen, and their conventional way of existence when they are seen in a mistaken manner. The first corresponds to the first being the ultimate way of existence when things are correctly seen. This corresponds to the perspective of enlightened beings. The latter, when they're the conventional way of existence, when they are seen, when things are seen in a mistaken manner, the latter to that of ordinary beings, though neither exists substantially. Neither the way of perceiving things from an enlightened perspective or the conventional way of perceiving things, neither of those things exist substantially. This latter point distinguishes the Madhyamaka conception of the two truths from the earlier Abhidharma understanding, according to which ultimately real entities, the dharmas, exist substantially and intrinsically. Skipping to the next page. Two questions immediately arise in this context. First, should the two truths be understood ontologically as two different kinds of things, or epistemologically as two different ways of seeing one thing? Second, if conventional truth is mistaken, how can we tell conventional truth from conventional falsity? Chandrakirti discusses the second question in the following two verses, and I will read those verses. Again, not wanting to completely lose our source text here. This is page 71 in the source, and I'm just going to read it. Deluded vision has, it's said, a double face, according to the organ's good or impaired functioning. Perception that derives from faulty faculties, compared with what the healthy senses know, are held to be mistaken. And everything the six undamaged senses grasps within the ordinary experience of the world is held as true according to the world. The rest, according to the world, is false. So, what does that mean? Back to Westerhoff, source page 77, second paragraph. Even though most of the beliefs ordinary beings have about the world belong to conventional truths, we can still differentiate between sense faculties generating these beliefs that operate normally and those that don't. If I look up at the sky and subsequently believe there is one moon, I believe a conventional truth. If I suffer from double vision and believe there is two, I believe a conventional falsity. So basically, what is being referred to here as conventional truth is that which can be perceived with functioning senses, um, such as looking up at the sky and seeing one moon. And I think importantly, he doesn't mean anything more philosophically sophisticated than that. I think this is a conventional truth is what you see is what you get, assuming that your senses are reliable. Skipping to or I'll read the next paragraph. In addition to internal conditions that render sense faculties unreliable, there are also external conditions that are prone to generate conventionally false beliefs. These include in illusion-inducing situations, as you might see a mirage in the desert or watch a magician's performance or take hallucinogenic drugs, as well as mistakes in reasoning we are likely to make as a result of external influences on our brain. If internal and external impairments are absent, our epistemic faculties will produce beliefs that are conventionally true. If they are compromised in the way just described, they will generate conventionally false beliefs. Chandrakirti also includes mistaken philosophical views under this group of external impairments. This means that there are certain philosophical positions that can be demonstrated to be deficient even at the level of conventional truth, as we can demonstrate at the level of conventional truth that someone with double vision does not see accurately. Or conversely, that there are conventionally true philosophical positions. Unfortunately, being convinced by such a position, such as Madhyamaka, will not make one enlightened. For that, one has to eliminate the underlying conceptualizing default mechanisms that generate deficient philosophical views in the first place. So then he talks about mistaken philosophical views, such as the Samkhya theory. And at the end of that next paragraph, like mirages and similar illusions, such philosophical positions cannot even be taken seriously in the context of ordinary worldly transactions, let alone be understood as providing us with an account of the fundamental nature of reality. So this is to say that this devastating critique of the four types of causation, self, other, both, neither, that those cannot obtain even at the level of conventional truth. Now that this doesn't mean that we can't talk about the pencil making the mark on the paper, but if we try to kind of get any more philosophically complex with that than that mere statement, we have what he's basically describing as mistaken perception, faulty perception, as though we had some sort of issue with our eyes. That philosophical positions of the kind of the Abhidharmists or the Samkhya's or any realist school, that those are faulty and are no good even for describing conventional truth.
Is that like saying argument for argument's sake?
You could
Like,
say so, yeah.
yeah.
You know, he talks about it as uh, the metaphor he uses is that you're climbing a tree, um, and that you've let go of the branch you're standing on before reaching the next one. In other words, you fall on your ass. Um, that, it's this sort of movement towards sophistication, but it leads to actual greater confusion. And this is kind of a at first I had trouble understanding it, but I think it's sort of a lovely image that Westerhoff provides. This is page 79 in the source book, page 336 in the source, or sorry, 79 in the source, 336 in the source book. Um, if we envisage the conceptual truth like a decorative fire screen in front of an open fireplace, the figures on the screen, Dido and Aeneas, say, would correspond to fabricated entities, and true statements about their relations, Dido standing on the right of Aeneas, to the conventional truth. So the image here is of a fireplace guard, and it's decorative and has these characters in metalwork on it, and you can make you can make accurate statements about their location and their relationship within the context of the fireplace screen. While these figures appear as entities in their own right and appear to stand in relation to one another, it is essential to be aware that the whole arrangement has been constructed not to reveal something, such as the real spatial relation between Dido and Aeneas, but to conceal, namely the empty cavity of the fireplace. So we have this sort of display, the fireplace screen, and we can make statements about that display, but the display itself is obscuring what's actually real, which is an empty space behind them. Um, this is sort of an inverted Plato's cave, where you have the appearance of figures that are, rather than being shadows of something ultimately real, are illusions in front of an ultimately unreal substrate. So I thought that was kind of lovely. I have no idea who Dido and Aeneas are. Um, yeah. So I want to move back ahead to this is page 84 in the source, and that is going to be page 341 in the source book. And it begins with the verse 34. 34. If things depended truly on specific attributes, denial of these same attributes would mean things are discounted. Emptiness would cause phenomena to disappear. But this does not make sense, which shows that things lack real existence. Westerhoff talks about this in the following verses as avoiding the view that intrinsic natures exist at the level of either truth. And I think this is a really common one, talking about common Buddhist distortions. Oh, thank you for the romance of Aeneas and Dido.
You can read it later, of course.
Yeah, some nice bedtime reading. I think this is a really common one that a lot of us fall into, of assuming conventional truth is the bad one and ultimate truth is the good one. That there's some ultimately real noumena uh, behind the veil of appearances. That, if we do enough mantras and we sit in a good enough posture and are really good, that we'll be able to unravel and and perceive directly. And you do hear discussion about a direct perception of emptiness, right? As though emptiness were some sort of dharma hiding just beyond the veil of appearance. Um, and Chandrakirti will not countenance this. Um, this is going down to the next, to the towards the bottom of the page, full paragraph. It is easy to mistake the Madhyamaka theory of the two truths for one postulating an appearance-reality divide, where an ultimate reality is to be discovered behind the conventional reality obscuring it. This is not Chandrakirti's position, who instead argues that once the world around us has been properly analyzed, no entities existing with intrinsic natures can be found to exist. All that can be found is the fact that things do not arise from themselves, others, etc., in a substantial way, which Chandrakirti describes as their true nature. But there is no ontologically freestanding rock bottom layer of reality. Fundamental particles, mathematical structures, foundational consciousness, whatever our favorite ontology might suggest to be discovered. Skipping ahead, the analysis Chandrakirti has in mind here is one looking for an object's ultimately ground of being. It does not refer to analysis at the conventional level when trying to find out whether planets move in circles or ellipses, how biological traits are inherited, or when Nalanda's university was founded. Right? So there's no mind-independent, self-sufficient entities. That doesn't mean that we can't describe entities without those qualities. Just as karma isn't ontologically grounded, but still has conventional causal efficacy. We can still talk about the movement of planets, the founding of Nalanda, the inheritance of biological traits, just so long as our talk about those things does not introduce a notion of swabhava. Another way to, this is just continuing in the next paragraph. Another way to misunderstand the two truths would be to hold that the above arguments have shown that there cannot be causal production from itself, from others, and so on at the level of ultimate truth, but that it can exist at the level of conventional truth. Chandrakirti, however, holds that his refutation of the four types of causal production applies at both levels of truth. In his auto-commentary, he qualifies this statement by pointing out that causal production with intrinsic characteristics, sphalaxana, does not obtain at either level of truth. This qualification is essential, for Chandrakirti certainly does not want to say that there is no causation whatsoever. After all, he has just introduced the notion of mere conditionality in his comments on verse 32 as the ordinary view of causality, and pointed out in his remarks on verse 34 that when left unanalyzed, the ordinary understanding of causation is to be maintained. Chandrakirti's point appears to be that even moving the four kinds of causal productions from the ultimate to the conventional level will not dissolve the problems that they face. One of the really interesting questions that I think naturally arises from this is a question of how fine-grained can our analysis of conventional reality be? If the possibility of talking about causality, even at a conventional level, is foreclosed, what does that mean for projects such as, science, scientific understanding of the world? And there's been some interesting scholarship on this topic, and I can circulate some material on that. But If the conventional is really only the surface level, how deep can it go, right? And is that I would like to suggest that there may be some sort of hidden moral agenda here. I'm just kind of riffing at this point. Um, that that if notions of describing the truth are basically limited, the truth in a capital T way, are limited to conversations about emptiness. Um, that has a certain moral force about the sorts of activities and conversations that humans ought to be engaged in. Um, right? Like if attempting to explain conventional phenomena is a fool's errand and philosophically indefensible. Um, it says a certain thing about how we ought to be spending our time, what we ought to be talking about. Does that make sense? Cynthia.
Well, I'm not sure if this is actually related. I mean, you are talking about, you mentioned science and moral agenda. For me, what I always sort of come to in terms of just the conventional level is sort of more on the, almost like engineering level that, for those, I used to work for the transit system, for example, and so I always find myself going, well, you still have to understand how things work in order to keep them working.
Mm,
And so if we sort of so when you say, all right, how should we spend our time? Well, obviously it depends on who we're talking about. As scholars of Buddhism, we can spend our time in a particular way, or practitioners of Buddhism, if we have some kind of intention about that. But for ordinary people doing ordinary jobs, you kind of hope that they do um, keep to understanding basic principles of how we think things work conventionally,
mhm,
because if they don't, you know, can you run a train system? Can you, you know, uh, help keep cars from bumping into each other and all sorts of other very practical realities?
mm,
Would our Zoom system work if people did not address, so it's like I'm not sure what we're whether that's what you're talking about is like how should it seems like there's still some utility in people spending their time understanding how things work in a conventional sense, even if they don't it doesn't philosophically work.
mhm.
Nevertheless, somehow, you know, trains run along tracks and planes miraculously stay up in the sky.
Yeah, and I think to a certain extent, the scientific project could really be defined as figuring out how things work, um, not as a project of doing ontology. So maybe there's some hope for it yet.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because science in some ways has the freedom of being, almost in the philosophical realm. It doesn't necessarily, it may or may not serve purposes. That's why I kind of shifted to this, the more practical, how do you build tall buildings, the engineering stuff is where you kind of, the very pragmatic stuff that keeps the world from falling down on our ears, seemingly.
Yeah.
But
I will say though, I mean, having a little bit of a background in science, yeah, I was working in a lab where we were doing like really foundational level research that was like so far away from anything that could ever show up on a clinical level. And nevertheless, there was always this attitude that the work that was being done in the lab was somehow going to be of practical importance in ways that we didn't quite understand.
no doubt, I'm not by any means saying it's not useful. It's
Mhm.
just the question of whether it has to work, or, anyway, that's just, but it is an interesting question in terms of how mundane things just keep rolling along, whether I just, as we go into these things, I could always imagine going back and talking to guys at work and saying, well, those things that you're, putting together on the track that don't really exist, it's like, what good does that do for them? You know,
Right, right. Yeah.
does that help them in any way? And does it help the society in any way? Which is a very bizarre thing.
I always remember this image that Judy Leaf gave of like someone really annoying at a retreat who you ask them for a cup of coffee and they say, "Well, of course a cup of coffee doesn't exist. How could I possibly hand you one?" So yeah, that feels like another mistaken philosophical perception. Um, yeah, we're running short on time, so I wondered if anyone had any last thoughts about Chandrakirti. We'll be talking more about him next week, but if there was anything else, burning desires or thoughts. Cool. All right. Well, then why don't we dedicate the merit? By this merit may all obtain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great east, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory. Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you,
Um,
Chris.
yeah, this was scary, but
Great.
I'm glad it's over.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thanks. And next week's going to be our last class. So, and of this particular, do we say semester? So, yeah, that's sort of exciting. And we'll, I think it should be stressed, however, that this is really just the beginning of this whole kind of project that Derek and I have put together. That's next going to take us into the Yogacara realm. Um, and in particular that and how that relates to Tathagata Garbha. And once we have those sort of pieces in place, along with the Madhyamaka, we've sort of set up the dialectic of these two poles of Mahayana thought that will produce extremely lively debate in Tibet. So anyway, that's a preview and advertisement and encouragement for y'all to keep showing up next year. Cool. Okay. See you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.